Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our subscription basket videos. If you missed part 1, go on back to our page to find the first part where we paint the brown version. Here's a couple basic of the materials you're going to need. You're going to need some paint brushes. A coarse bristle brush works really well for this project. The coarser the better. A sponge. And then these are the parts to the basket for the back side of it, so for the second side. We're going to use some white paint on this side, so we're going to use white and hurricane gray. And we're going to need some glue to assemble when we're all finished. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the white. We're going to do a white base coat on our entire basket. So you can use any brush of your choice for this. Get a little bit of water on it. Water down the paint just a little bit. Makes it spread on a little bit easier, and then that way you can still see your lines through the paint because we're going to need those as guidelines. Try to go all in the same direction as best as you can, just to keep the brush strokes going the same direction. Keep adding on a little bit more paint and a little bit more water as you're going along. I'm going to speed up the process a little bit of me painting the background color of this basket. It's just straightforward. Make sure you get everything covered. Make sure you can still see your lines through everything. Nice even coat as best as you can. And when you're finished, it should look something a little bit like this. So that way, you see, you can still see my lines, and it's a nice even coat of white. Next, we're going to start moving on to do our shading. So I'm taking just straight white, not watered down, and I'm adding it to the little square pieces on the basket. So in between the crisscross pieces, there's little squares. Just like in the brown basket, we added brown to those. We're going to be adding just straight white, not watered down for these. I'm going to speed up the process a little bit on this one. Just make sure you get all of the squares, just like we did with the brown basket in the previous video. Get as close to the lines as you can with them. A nice straight brush is the easiest way to do this. And once you're finished with all the squares, we're going to move on to the other parts of our basket. With the same watered down white that we used for the background of the basket, we're going to do the same thing on the top rim of the basket. Go right over top of those laser lines. It's not super important if we have them. It just helps you line up the handles when you're assembling everything. When you're done with the top rim, we're going to go ahead. Don't worry about painting those two spacer pieces. They have the angles on them. You just want to have to worry about painting the front sides of the handles themselves. We're still using that same watered down white. Once we finish painting all of our basket pieces, you're going to want to go through and just make sure everything has the same consistent coat that you want on it. I decided to go back through and add a second coat to this one. It looked a little bit lighter than the others. So I'm still using the same watered down white paint as we were originally, just adding on a second coat to this one to make it a little bit of a darker color. Now that we finished painting all of our basket pieces, I'm going through with some of the gray. We're going to use the same technique as we did on the first basket just to create some shading. We're going to use the piece of paper to use as our lines to make sure we don't put paint where we don't want it to be. Making sure our paper is on the correct side of the line, so you're going to want your brush to go over top of the spot where you want the shading and the paper to be on the side where you don't want the shading. Get a little bit on your brush and make sure you wipe off any excess. You don't want a whole lot at once. A little bit is better. That way you can do it a few more times if needed. Make sure you go around the entire of the basket looking for the intersection lines of where the pieces crisscross in front of each other. You're going to want to go on the back side of the line, so make sure that the piece that is in front does not get paint on it and the piece that is in back does. Reload your brush as needed. Make sure you're wiping off any excess. And take your time with this. You want to make sure that you're putting the paint in the right spot. So if you need to stop and think about it and look at it, make sure that's really the spot where you want it. Take your time. When you think you've got all of the intersections where you want them, just go ahead and look around, make sure you're not missing any, and then you can start brushing on some gray, the little bit of the gray paint around the outside edge of your basket, just to give it a little bit of more of a curved shape to it. Give it a little bit of shadowing around the edge. Remember, every time you load your brush, make sure you get some of it off. And then I was putting a little bit of distressing on the top of mine to kind of grunge it up a little bit. Staying along the ridge of where the lip is going to be, went a little bit darker to give us a little bit of a shadowing. As you're going through, if you find more spots where you've forgotten to do the shadowing on the basket part itself, just go ahead and finish those off before we start moving on to the next step. I went ahead and I put just a tiny bit of gray over top of the entirety of the basket just to give it a little bit more of a grunge, dirty-ish look. Then I'm going to do the same on the top of the basket pieces, so the lid and the handles, and there I am searching for my well-loved sponge. So with these sponges, I always just cut off the dried part, and then I have a fresh new sponge for the next time. Then I go through and I just add a little tiny bit more shadowing to the edge of the basket, accentuating the curved part of the basket. As you're finishing up with the sides of the main basket piece, just kind of step back and take a look at it, make sure everything looks the way you want it to, and then you can move on to the lip of the basket and then the handles. So all I'm doing here is I'm putting a very minimal amount of paint on my sponge, and I'm just going around the edge of the lid of the basket just to give it a little bit of shadowing, give it some definition so it's not quite so 2D. Just a tiny bit around the edge. Less is more. And then here I am. If you end up putting a little bit too much paint on yours, go through with a little bit of water and you can soften those lines. So I didn't like how sharp of an edge mine ended up having. It didn't blend as well as I had hoped it would. So I'm going through with just a paintbrush with a tiny bit of water on it and just blending out those edges and softening them up so they're not so harsh, not quite so dark. The joys with paint: if you don't like it, you could always paint over top of it and start over. I've been known to do that from a time to two. So now we're moving on to do the same process with the handles of the basket. Again, just a little bit on the edge. I like to take my sponge and kind of flick it off of the edge, and then that way you only have a little bit on your piece. When doing this, the less paint you have on your sponge, the better. That way it doesn't glob like how mine did up at the top by where the circle was. It put on a little bit too dark. The less paint you have on your sponge, the better it is to start with. But again, I just went through with a damp brush and softened a little bit those lines. You can already see the difference between the handle that I'm working on now versus the handle that I already did. And just the way the different shadings give the piece a little bit more Reload your sponge as needed. Try not to put too much paint on it. Should always dab off your sponge into a clean area. I didn't on that time, and I should have. And now I'm just going over top of my piece with just a tiny bit of the gray, just to give it a little bit more of the grunge to match the rest of the basket. Soften the lines with a damp brush. Now that you have all of your pieces painted, you can go ahead and start assembling your basket to see how it looks. Make sure you have the angle pieces of your basket for those spacers in the correct direction. They just go right underneath the handle, so they don't need to be painted. Once everything gets assembled, you won't be able to see them. The handles of the basket should line up with the bottom part of the basket that juts out. And once you're ready to assemble, use your glue. You can use either super glue, like I have. I use a Gorilla Wood super glue. Or you can just use a regular wood glue. The regular wood glue is going to take a little bit longer for everything to set up. So if you don't mind the waiting for the setup time, you can go ahead and just use wood glue. I like to use the super glue because it sets in a matter of seconds typically. Just hold it down for a few seconds, make sure it's adhered well. Make sure everything is lining up flush. And keep holding it down just a little bit longer. Make sure everything is attached. So now that I have my lid on, I can line up my spacer pieces. So the spacer piece is going to line up with the bottom part of the basket there, the pieces that stick out. And then you're going to put your angle right up against the lid of the basket. Make sure everything is lining up flush with each other. You don't want any pieces sticking out. And then hold that down for a few seconds as well. While you're holding down that one, I like to be efficient. I have two hands. I can do two things at once. So I'm going to go ahead and add on my second spacer. Make sure that one is lining up flush on the bottom of the basket on that side, and that the angle piece is going up to the lid. And again, I got 2 hands, so I'm going to be doing 2 things at once. I'm going to add a little bit of glue. With this glue in particular, a tiny bit goes a long way. So you notice I'm just putting little dots on it all along my piece. I don't need to cover the whole thing. Just a little bit will hold it. Make sure that piece is lining up where the laser lines are on your lid, as well as making sure the bottom is lining up with the bottom of the basket part there. The last step is going to be adding the other handle piece, just a couple dots of glue. If you're using wood glue, make sure you're not using too much. You don't want it to ooze out the sides of your project and leave glue lines everywhere. Nice firm pressure for a couple seconds to get that to adhere. Then once it's adhered, we're going to actually attach it to the back side of our other basket. So as I mentioned in the first video, we have since redesigned these baskets just a smidge. So mine may look a little bit different than the pieces look on yours. I'm just adding a couple glue dots around the outside edge of my basket and then a couple in the middle. And then when it comes to adhering your basket, you're just going to make sure that both sides are lining up correctly with each other. They're nice and flush. And you're just going to hold it down until it sticks. If you're using wood glue, you're going to want to look at the manufacturer's instructions on how long it takes for that glue to set. Sometimes I think they set in about 30 minutes or so, so you're going to want to set your project down, and then if you have anything heavy to put on top of your project, like some books or something, you can use that almost as a clamp just to keep everything in place as the glue is setting. Once your glue is set, you can go ahead and add it into your base. I, at this point, had forgotten to paint my base, so I was going through and I was going to add some brown paint onto the bottom of my base. The bases do fit very snugly together, so you're going to want a nice firm hand in trying to get your basket into the base. And then once you have your basket in the base, it'll stand up and you won't have to worry about it getting knocked over. So there you have it. You have a front and a back side of your basket. So the baskets that we have sent out, they have a double hole at the top. The double hole at the top makes it so that you can put your insert on either side, whether you want white or black, you can do either. From here, you can use paint markers if you want to. That's a black paint marker, a thin black paint marker. You could use it to add more accent lines to your basket, more shading, or just decoration to your basket if you wanted to. With paint markers, you're going to, when you first get them, you're going to want to activate them. To activate them, you shake them, and then you press down on the tip onto a piece of scrap paper or into your paint palette. And then here I'm demonstrating where you could be adding some of those accent lines if you so choose. I chose not to add paint lines onto this one. I liked it the way it was, but I've seen them both ways and they both look nice.